The last time we spoke, we talked about the fact that even though the Flavian Caesars created the Gospels, there had to be some intermediary steps before that. They didn't just all of a sudden decide to create the Gospels. Can you go into some detail about, first of all, the war between the Romans and the Jews, and what exactly happened? Was there any literature indicating that this was happening? What was going on at the time?
Well, the Maccabees had established a religious state in, I believe, 167 BCE.
Okay.
This lasted for over 100 years, but at a certain point, the family of Herod somehow interjected itself into the Maccabean authority. And a civil war broke out between two members of the Maccabees. The Herods sided with one of them and invited Pompey to come in and essentially end the war. From that point forward, the Maccabees were never in complete control of Israel. The family that was in charge, the Herods, were clearly puppets of Rome. The family had a lot of connections to the Flavians.
We're talking about the Sadducean Jews, are we?
Well, I don't really use those terms. Those terms come from the Gospels, and I simply don't trust those terms. I think a better dividing line is simply religious Jews and Jews that were working for Rome. That is the dividing line of Judaism that I think was really in play in this era.
Okay.
And the Herods attempted to become Jewish. They took Maccabean princesses and married them so that their children could then be seen as in the Maccabean lineage. But the fact is, the Herods were very connected to the family of Caesars, the Flavians, and as were the Alexanders. Now, Philo Alexander is one of the most famous, purportedly Jewish philosophers in history, and he practiced and philosophized a sort of what's called a Hellenized version of Judaism. Clearly, it was something that could connect to the Roman Empire. But this wasn't the version of Judaism that you read about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a very xenophobic and militaristic and nationalistic kind of religion. So I think that the family of Alexander and the Herods were essentially efforts by Rome, or were working with Rome, to try to transform Judaism into a version of Judaism that could live with Rome's authority.
Are you talking about a more pacifistic version?
Yes, certainly one that wouldn't rebel. What they were hoping to do was to essentially take Jewish scripture and interpret it in such a way that the Messianic movement would not rebel against Rome. And I wanted just to talk for a second about the connections between the Alexanders and the Herods and the Flavians. Philo's brother was the head of Alexandria, which was the wealthiest city in Rome. He was the Albrach, which is the ruler of Alexandria. And so he had a lot of financial connections to the Roman Empire. His son was Tiberius Alexander. So Tiberius Alexander is the nephew of Philo. Tiberius Alexander is the general of the Flavian army that is attacking Jerusalem.
No, I see.
So in other words, he is so connected to the Flavians that he actually put him in charge of the army, even though he is a Jew and has these connections to Jewish scholarship. His brother had married Bernice, who was a Herod, who ended up being the mistress of Titus. So you can see these families are so closely interrelated. And they all have a problem, which is that there is a movement, a Messianic movement in Judea that will not accept Roman rule. So when you look at the Gospels, in order to have produced that literature, you needed a tremendous understanding of Jewish scripture. This is where it comes from. It comes from the Jews that had these financial relationships with the Caesars, were making a lot of money on the relationship, and were secular. They obviously did not ascribe to the theologic vision that the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls did. So the Roman Empire, the Roman effort to control Judaism goes all the way back to Julius Caesar, who appointed the high priests. So at the very onset of the Roman control of Judea, they tried to interject Rome into the Jewish religion so that the authority structure would be pro-Roman, and then they could thereby keep the country pacified and keep it as a tax-producing region.
I see. Well, I find this all, very interesting, but, no one has actually seen that before until your book, Caesar's Messiah. They saw a more pro-Roman perspective in the literature, but nobody really knew where that came from.
Right. The symbolism in the Gospels has simply been misunderstood. It's incredible, but it just has not been grasped, even though it's fairly straightforward.
So we do know that the Gospels are really fiction, a fictionalized satire.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's not really history. And up
Absolutely
until
not.
now, it's been accepted as history.
And that's why it hasn't been understood. People look at it as either religious literature or as having a basis in history, and they attempt to understand it through those frameworks. This gets you nowhere. If you want to understand the Gospels, you have to first, as I had mentioned in our prior show, understand the typology that the authors are using, which is visible in the very first page. Simply follow the story of Jesus up until his 40 days in the wilderness and compare them to the experience that Moses had. In Genesis and Exodus, you'll see Joseph goes down to Egypt. There's a massacre of the innocents. They take the same sentence. Those are dead who sought your life. And what you're having is the parallel events are occurring in a very specific sequence. The sequence of events in Genesis and Exodus are occurring in Matthew. So you can walk through until you get to the three temptations of Jesus in these 40 days in the wilderness are obviously a representation of the 40 years in the wilderness and the temptation of God by the Israelites. So there's no question, scholars are not confused by this. You can see that there is this very precise genre of typology that the authors are using. So now when you come to the very next line in the Gospel, which is Jesus' gathering of his disciples at the Sea of Galilee, and he says, if you follow me, you'll become fishers of men, it's not a stretch to try to look at this passage as perhaps having the same structural basis as the ones that just led up to it, which is typology. And, of course, now it links directly to Titus, who, in fact, fished for men. His followers fished for men at the Sea of Galilee. And then once you link up the two campaigns between Jesus' ministry and Titus's campaign, the events just make perfect sense as you move forward.
Well, what is it exactly that people like Dr. Avalos missed? That
Avalos?
He's a biblical scholar, is
Yeah.
he not?
Yep.
So what is it that biblical scholars are missing? What do they need to look for?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's just in the debates that I've had, obviously some scholars do support the work at this point, but for example, Robert Price wrote a completely negative review of Caesar's Messiah, and it's interesting. It's on the web. You can go and read it. And it's quite amazing in that he doesn't sort of negate the scholarship. He simply says that these events are not related because Atwill has a case of parallel mania. And what's fascinating about this particular charge is that it is literally the reverse of what is true, because when I say that, parallel mania or trying to see information that doesn't exist between parallels is because the parallels are too vague or they have no context. In other words, they're so, one person in a million might see this, therefore it's a very weak parallel, or that the context just makes it impossible that the writers would have been describing the same thing. The fact is that the Roman humor uses the literal parallel. In other words, when Jesus says, if you follow me, you will become a fisher of men, the event it links to is literally fishing for men. So you see, you can make certain criticisms of the parallel, but one that you can't make is parallelmania, because it is not.
It's a literal.
Right. In other words, I'm using the literal interpretation of the words. When I say that that when Jesus says, "Eat of my flesh," he is foreseeing an event in the coming war, which occurs 40 years in the future, so when they date his ministry, regarding cannibalism of a Messiah. I am focusing on the literal interpretation of the words and taking an event which has the literal activity. The scholars who are attacking the thesis, they're the ones who have these metaphorical interpretations. So the parallelmania charge is, frankly, just incoherent.
Well, what is it that Jewish scholars need to be looking for? You see, in Judaism, since the destruction of the temple, the table has replaced the altar.
Right.
And so we can understand somebody saying, having symbolic dinner.
Sure.
So that's an understandable thing, and that might be a Jewish thing to do.
It could be. But I think that the idea of, well, first of all, I mean, just from a theological perspective, the idea of a Christ who is crucified is unlikely, because that individual would not have had the power of David. But in that era, the Messiah that they were looking for was an individual who had the power of David. In other words, he was the son of David, who had been the anointed one, who had a connection to God. He wouldn't have been captured by the Romans and crucified. So the story is a little, weird just on its face, but the way that Jewish scholars will be able to make progress there's only one way that anyone can understand the Gospels, and that is you have to start on page 1 and understand the typologic system that is used to link Jesus to Moses. And then you have to try to, with that understanding, look at the Gospels with fresh eyes and see if, in fact, the ministry is linked to someone else. And that's when the individual that Jesus is prophesizing, the Son of Man, who in fact did raise the temple, did encircle Jerusalem with the wall, and did lay low the Galilean towns, suddenly this individual pops out. Because remember, we're not just dealing with typologic prophecies, which are it's more complicated. We're dealing with literal prophecies. There's only one individual in history that could be the Son of Man that Jesus envisioned. See, the Gospels are actually a little puzzle. And the puzzle is simply, who is the Son of Man that Jesus is envisioning? The Christian scholars, and I think the Jewish scholars, have always accepted that it's Jesus himself. He's predicting that he will return, the coming of the Christ. Everyone is looking for this. Well, the fact is, that's not really what the authors were talking about. They were talking about the literal individual who would encircle Jerusalem with the wall, raise the temple, and lay low the Galilean towns. It's Titus. As soon as you take this perspective and start to do scholarship, Titus just pops right out of the Gospels. And it's interesting. It wouldn't surprise me if it's Jewish scholars that really break the Caesar's Messiah thesis into the public domain, because the historians, it's such a change in their paradigm that they tend to defend it, because they're defending their own, perspective. But I am hopeful that the book is being reviewed by Jewish scholars as we speak, and I think that some courageous individuals are going to step forward, and we'll start to see news stories about it, and once that happens, it'll very quickly become sort of the widely held paradigm of understanding of the Gospels and the origins of Christianity, because it's simply not that difficult.